Welcome to Study Session 9, IKS Exchanges and Practices in Africa. Introduction. The practices and exchanges of indigenous knowledge systems illustrate the use of indigenous knowledge in developing cost-effective and sustainable survival strategies for the general well-being of the people. In particular, indigenous practices can adapt in response to gradual changes in the social and natural environments, since the practices are closely interwoven with people's cultural values, while the exchange of indigenous knowledge is basically a process of exchange of information from one community to another. In this study, you will learn about the processes of exchange of indigenous knowledge within and between countries and indigenous knowledge systems practices in Africa. Learning outcomes. At the end of this study, you should be able to 1. Explain the exchange of indigenous knowledge systems. 2. Explain indigenous knowledge systems practices in Africa. Exchange of indigenous knowledge systems. The integration of indigenous knowledge into the development process is essentially a process of exchange of information from one community to another. The process of exchange of IK within and between developing countries and between developing and industrial countries involves essentially 6 steps: recognition and identification, validation, recording and documentation, storage in retrievable repositories, transfer, dissemination. 1. Recognition and identification. Some indigenous knowledge IK may be embedded in a mix of technologies or in cultural values, rendering them unrecognizable at first glance to the external observer. Thus, technical and social analysis may therefore be required to identify IK. 2. Validation. This involves an assessment of IK's significance and relevance to solve problems, reliability, that is, not being an accidental occurrence, functionality, how well does it work, effectiveness, and transferability. 3. Recording and documentation. This is a major challenge because of the tacit nature of IK. It is typically exchanged through personal communication from master to apprentice, from parent to child, and so on. In some cases, modern tools could be used, while in other circumstances, it may be appropriate to rely on more traditional methods, for example, taped narration, drawings. 4. Storage in retrievable repositories. Storage is not limited to text documents or electronic format. It could also include tapes, films, storytelling, and so on. 5. Transfer. This step goes beyond merely conveying the knowledge to the recipient. It also includes the testing of the knowledge in the new environment. Dissemination. Dissemination to wider community adds the developmental dimension to the exchange of knowledge and could promote a wider and deeper impact of knowledge transfer. Indigenous knowledge systems practices in Africa. Practices of indigenous knowledge refer to examples and cases that illustrate the use of indigenous knowledge in developing cost-effective and sustainable survival strategies for poverty alleviation and income generation, and for the general well-being of the people. Indigenous practices can generally adapt in response to gradual change in the social and natural environments, since indigenous practices are closely interwoven with people's cultural values and passed down from generation to generation. Some of the practices include postpartum maternal and child healthcare rights and observances among the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria. During the 4-week period after birth, called Omugwo, the mother and the child are secluded and relieved from all other chores. They are cared for by the grandmother of the newborn. The new mother is given a stimulating hot soup made with dried fish, meat, yams, plenty of pepper, and a special herbal seasoning called uda, which makes the uterus contract, and this helps in expelling blood clots. The diet helps to restore blood lost during childbirth, to restore energy, facilitate the healing of wounds, and restores normal bodily functions and promotes lactation. There is also the making and use of traps for fishing in wetland ecosystems in southeastern Nigeria. The practice is most common among the inhabitants who live adjacent to the wetlands formed by the tributaries of the Idemili and Niger rivers, which stretch for over 80 kilometers between Obosi and Siala in southeastern Nigeria. The practices reported here were observed in Oba, a town in Ose River in Anambra State of Nigeria. Trap fishing from the Ose rivers dates back many generations and certainly as far back as the 18th century. Fishing is a year-round activity. Small trap fishing is usually done during the rainy season, while big trap fishing is done during the dry season. The practice involves knowing how to make the right trap for the right season and knowing where in the ecosystem to place the trap in order to catch the desired fish. The materials for the trap are derived solely from the raffia palm. They consist of solid strands for the body of the trap and fibers for holding the strands in place. The strands are obtained from the midrib of the compound leaf front. Actual trap making involves twisting pairs of fibers over the raffia strands in a figure-8 fashion. The practice in its entirety, from the making of the trap to the actual fishing, is an embodiment of indigenous knowledge. For instance, the collection of strands for making the trap frame requires knowledge of the quality of the plant. The application of knowledge about earthworm secretions is definitely indigenous knowledge, as is the knowledge of how to hook the worms and attach it to the trap so that fishes cannot steal the bait from outside without entering the trap. It is also indigenous knowledge that tells the fisherman that it is not the earthworm itself that attracts fish, but the chemicals which the worm secretes from its body. The practice is embedded in the socio-cultural values of the people in the sense that some of the fish caught through trap fishing are required elements in certain traditional festivities in the community, including marriages. Summary of study session. In this study, you have learned 1. The process of exchange of indigenous knowledge within and between communities. 2. The indigenous practices among the Igbo people in southeast Nigeria. 3. The indigenous knowledge systems practices in Africa. The indigenous practices which can be said to be generally adopted in response to gradual changes in the social and natural environments, since indigenous practices are closely interwoven with people's cultural values and passed down from generation to generation. This is the end of study session 9. Thank you.